This video will go through how to diagnose and repair a no crank, no start on an 8th generation Honda Civic. For our car, we have determined that the ignition starter switch is broken and we'll replace that, but the video is helpful in diagnosing other common no crank, no start problems. The ignition starter switch is a simple repair. Many people seem to have trouble when replacing the whole lock assembly, which is not required if only the sensor is bad. So in this video, I show how to remove the whole assembly, as the lock assembly is another common problem people have with their keys not turning or getting stuck in the ignition. Give yourself a couple hours for the repair, but you'll probably need much less than that. So here's the problem. You go to turn the key to start and you don't get the starter motor to crank at all. You might hear nothing, or sometimes people hear a buzzing sound of a relay turning on and off. For our case, you will see the Prindle displayed on the cluster, and sometimes wiggling the key might help intermittently get the starter to engage. Those are signs of the ignition switch problem, and we'll go through how to replace that in a few minutes. For diagnosing a no crank, no start, there's a few different options of what the problem might be. This slide lists some of those options, the battery being a very common problem that's pretty easy to diagnose. Main relay, which I haven't heard of anyone having that problem, but if you're not getting power to anything. There is a park neutral switch on automatic transmissions vehicles, and there is a clutch switch on a manual trans vehicles that both of those have to be working properly to get the crank. The ignition starter switch is a common problem. That's what we're replacing in this video. The starter cut relay is a rare problem, but it's a simple repair as well. And finally, the most common no crank, no start for these Civics are the starter actually being bad. In this car, in 8 years, it lasted on the original OEM starter, and it was replaced, and then a year later the replacement failed. Luckily that was covered under warranty. There's very few tools required for this repair. Depends if you're just doing the sensor, the whole key assembly, or if you're just doing the starter or park neutral switch. But in general, just need a Phillips screwdriver if you're doing the sensor. And if you're doing the whole key assembly, you need a hammer and a chisel also. For diagnostics, a test light or a multimeter will be needed, and of course a 10mm wrench for removing the battery ground. This schematic shows an overview of the starter circuitry. It's pretty straightforward. These devices unfortunately are located throughout the vehicle. But basically the battery goes through the main relay, which is located in the underhood fuse box. That voltage goes through the ignition switch, which is the problem in our vehicle. The voltage comes out of the ignition switch, goes through the starter cut relay, and to the starter. Before the starter cut relay, or the relay itself is grounded either by the park neutral switch or the clutch switch, depending if you have automatic or manual transmission. As we said, our problem is the ignition switch, but this will help you identify where your problem is. This diagram shows the ignition switch sensor, which is bad in our vehicle. It's only held on with 2 screws, and we'll show the removal of that later. Again, I'm going to remove the whole lock assembly in this video, because that goes bad for a lot of people, and it's not much more difficult, so we'll go through that process as well. Okay, on to the diagnostics. Before you do any electrical work, of course, remove the ground connection from the battery. You might need to leave that connected if you're doing some voltage checks. 2 ways to go about this diagnosis. You could start at the ignition switch, or actually the battery, and go forward through all the systems shown in that schematic, or we could start at the starter and go backwards. In both cases, you need to have good battery voltage first, so that's an easy first check. You could turn on the headlights and see if they're bright and on when you try to crank. If the headlights are dim, you might want to check the health of your battery before going further. A lot of auto stores will test your battery for free, or if you have a multimeter, you could easily test it as well and monitor the voltage as you try to crank. Could be that your battery isn't strong enough to crank the engine, so batteries are a common problem. That's what you want to rule out first. If you have no headlights at all or no power to the vehicle, then your main relay is probably bad if your battery is not dead completely. I haven't heard of main relay problems, but that is located under the underhood fuse box, and that's something you'd want to check if you're not getting voltage. By far the most common problem on these cars is the starter. Unfortunately, the starter's not easy to get to. You can't even see it from the top. But if you go under the car, then you will be able to see the starter solenoid. And so, since starters are a common problem, that's what I'd recommend for testing first, so going from the starter and going backwards. So you could test the voltage at the starter solenoid when you're trying to crank it. And if you have voltage there, but you don't get a crank, then you've solved your problem. The starter is the issue, and you'll want to work on getting the starter replaced. If you don't have voltage at the starter solenoid, then we have to do further diagnostics. The next step would be checking the ignition switch. So this assumes you don't have any voltage at the starter solenoid when you try to crank. So now let's jump to the ignition switch. It's a simple test. You could either remove the connector, then check the sensor for continuity if you have a multimeter using this schematic. Or you could leave the connector installed with the battery still hooked up and back probe the connector using a small paper clip. So you'd want to look for voltage at the yellow wire when the key is turned to start. Of course, you want to verify that you have voltage to the connector at the white wire. You could tell that with a multimeter or a test light, or if your cluster turns awake when you turn the key to the run position, then you have voltage there. So in our case, we turned the key to start and we did not get voltage to the yellow wire, so that told us our ignition switch sensor was bad. If you have voltage coming out of the white wire at the ignition switch, but not to the starter, you have two more paths to go down. First path is the park neutral switch for an automatic transmission, or the clutch switch for a manual. The automatic's very easy to diagnose. If you have the Prindle light showing on the cluster and it reads park or neutral when you move the shifter, then yours is working correct. For a manual transmission vehicle, the clutch switch is located at the clutch pedal, and you could do a continuity check on that with a multimeter. If the park neutral or clutch switch are working, the last possibility is the starter cut relay. This is a rare problem also, but it's easy to change. The starter cut relay is located in the passenger compartment fuse box, which is located under the driver's side footwell. When you remove the trim, you could easily replace that for about $5 at any local parts store. Now on to the repair. There are 3 Phillips screws located under the steering wheel. If you remove these, the trim around the steering wheel will come apart and can be removed. Now you can see the ignition switch sensor, and the entire lock assembly can be seen easily. If you're just removing the sensor, all you have to do is remove those two Phillips screws on the sensor and the connector and replace it. Screws are a little awkward to get to, but they aren't tight, so you should be able to get to them easily. I'm going to take off the whole lock assembly since that's what some people are having trouble with. I'm going to remove the Phillips screws holding the lock assembly to the white plastic assembly. The screws are kind of tough to get to with the steering wheel in place, so you rotate the steering wheel around to get the best access, but you can get to them. You can turn the steering wheel without the car on, it just has some resistance. After you get those off, or before, you could take off the ignition switch connector. And then this is the part which causes some people trouble if they're removing the whole lock assembly. these two bolts holding the lock assembly from the top clamshell, they don't have a head. They're security bolts to deter someone from taking this off and stealing your car, basically. Good news is these bolts are really soft and they're not torqued very tight. So there's multiple methods of getting them off. Some people use a Dremel tool to notch the bolts and try to, make something you could put a screwdriver on. Some people try to drill them out. To me, what worked easiest was a hammer and a chisel. Again, it's a soft bolt, so the chisel was able to dig into it easily, and the bolts aren't torqued very tight at all. So if you tap the chisel in a counterclockwise direction on the bolt, they'll start spinning. After a couple of taps, you could use your hand and remove it. So not too bad actually once you get to it. Okay, once you have the lock assembly off, or if you're not taking the lock assembly off, all you do is swap the sensor, install everything in the reverse order. Since we took off the lock assembly, for the clamshell we had those bolts that didn't have heads on them. So we went and purchased two M8 by 1.25 by 16 millimeter socket head cap screws, or you could get button head cap screws. And then you could just install them with an Allen head wrench. As you install the lock assembly, you'll see there is a wheel lock in the column that snaps kind of into the groove. So you kind of align those. It goes together pretty easily. I don't think you could really put it together wrong, but you have to make sure this groove snaps into place, and then you'll be able to align the clamshells and bolt it together. So you reattach the lock assembly, reconnect the connector. You might want to verify the vehicle starts before putting all the trim back together, and then we will see if ours start. So we have everything back together, and we'll try it out, and looks like the engine cranks and starts, so life is good again. Thank you for watching. Good luck with your repair. Hopefully our car is good for a while, but if not, I'll be sure to post a video if there are any other repairs required, or if people are having specific questions. Please don't hesitate to ask questions in the comments, as I'm happy to help with what I can. Thanks.